The heavy, stale air of the courtroom seemed to weigh down on everyone present. The cold marble walls reflected the murmur of voices, the shuffle of papers, and the rhythmic ticking of a distant clock, but none of it mattered in that moment. All eyes were on the young boy sitting at the defendant's table. Jaden Carter, 17 years old, had been in this courtroom more times than he could count, but today was different. Today, he was not just another black teenager accused of something he didn't do. Today, he was about to face a judge whose reputation for harsh sentences against people of color was well known. Jaden sat with his shoulders hunched, his hands fidgeting in his lap. His dark eyes were fixed on the polished wood of the table in front of him, as if willing the words he was about to speak into existence. His mother sat behind him, hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face etched with worry. She had told him all his life to keep his head down, to avoid trouble, but somehow this time it wasn't enough. The courtroom was quiet. Even the murmurs from the back of the room seemed to fall away, as if the space itself was holding its breath. The judge, Judge Harold Willis, sat at the front of the room with a stern expression on his face. The gavel rested in his hand like an instrument of finality, ready to bring down judgment. Jaden's lawyer, a tired middle-aged woman named Eleanor Walker, stood beside him, her hand lightly resting on his shoulder. She had fought hard for this case. She had fought to make sure Jaden wouldn't just be another statistic, another victim of a justice system that seemed designed to fail him from the start. But now, as she glanced at the judge, she knew this case was bigger than just Jaden's innocence. It was about the systemic forces at play, the prejudices that permeated every aspect of the law, from the police officer who had falsely accused him of robbery to the judge who was about to decide his fate. Jaden's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for the judge to speak, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had been accused of a crime he didn't commit, stealing a car. It was a crime he knew nothing about. But in a world that looked at him and saw only his skin, it didn't matter. The color of his skin had already sentenced him before he had ever stepped foot in this courtroom. Judge Willis cleared his throat, breaking the silence. He looked over his glasses, his eyes cold and piercing as they met Jaden's. The room seemed to tense, as if everyone knew what was coming next. Jaden Carter, the judge began, his voice echoing in the quiet room. You stand here today accused of grand theft auto, a crime that has been committed too many times by young people like you. Your record isn't clean. You've had run-ins with the law before. I don't see any reason to take mercy on you. The words hit Jaden like a punch in the stomach. He had heard them before. Black boys, accused of petty crimes, sentenced with harshness. No one cared to listen to their side of the story. No one cared that Jaden had spent his life avoiding trouble, keeping his head down, and trying to survive in a system that never seemed to want him to succeed. Eleanor Walker opened her mouth to object, but the judge raised a hand to silence her. He continued, his tone growing colder, more detached. Your kind always causes trouble, Judge Willis said. His words more than just a statement of fact. They were an accusation. And in this court, we do not tolerate troublemakers. Jaden's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to stand up, to shout, to demand justice, but something kept him rooted to the chair. His heart was beating too fast. His hands were shaking. The injustice was too much. He could feel his mother's eyes burning into the back of his head. She had raised him to be better than this, to rise above the stereotypes. But how could he rise above something so deeply ingrained? There was again the same old story, repeated over and over again. Black boys, particularly young men like Jaden, were seen as trouble. They were seen as guilty, even before they were given a chance to prove their innocence. But this time, something was different. As Jaden sat there, his mind raced. He remembered his grandfather's words, the lessons his mother had tried so hard to instill in him. And most importantly, the photo that had always been with him, tucked away, hidden, but never far from his reach. It wasn't just a photo. It was a reminder of his family, of the legacy of love and sacrifice that had been passed down through generations. A legacy that didn't fit the narrative the judge was trying to impose on him. A narrative that had been forced upon so many before him. His pulse quickened as he reached into his pocket. He felt the edges of the worn-out photograph, his mother, his father, and his little sister. Their smiles, frozen in time, seemed to remind him of who he really was. Eleanor turned to him, her face full of worry, but Jaden wasn't listening anymore. He wasn't listening to the judge's harsh words or the whispers from the courtroom. He stood up slowly, the photo clutched in his hand, and walked toward the front of the room. The entire courtroom went silent. The room held its breath as Jaden walked toward the front of the courtroom. Every eye was fixed on him, the tension so thick that it felt like the walls were closing in. The judge, the prosecutor, the jurors, they were all watching with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Jaden's footsteps were slow but deliberate, the worn edges of the family photo clenched tightly in his hand. Eleanor Walker was still standing beside him, her eyes wide in confusion. She didn't know what Jaden was doing. She had seen him nervous before, but this was different. There was a quiet resolve in his movements, something she had never seen in him before. "Jaden, what are you doing?" Eleanor whispered urgently, her voice barely a breath. But Jaden didn't respond. He simply walked to the front of the courtroom, where Judge Willis still sat, his expression growing more incredulous by the second. Jaden stopped a few feet away from the judge's bench and held up the photo. It wasn't a large photo, just a small, worn snapshot of a family outing. His mother, father, and little sister all grinned for the camera, their faces glowing with happiness. It was a stark contrast to the cold, judgmental atmosphere of the courtroom. The room fell into an eerie silence. Even the judge seemed taken aback, momentarily distracted by the image in front of him. For a moment, the harshness of the courtroom seemed to soften, as if the photo was pulling everyone away from the severity of the moment, forcing them to confront something more personal, more human. Jaden's voice broke the silence, steady and calm, despite the turmoil churning inside him. "This is my family," he said, his words firm but quiet. "This is who I am. I'm not just some statistic. I'm not a troublemaker. I'm not a criminal." The judge's eyes flicked to the photo briefly, then back to Jaden. He raised an eyebrow, clearly disinterested, as if he couldn't care less about the image that Jaden was holding. His fingers tapped impatiently against the desk. "This is not the time for your personal stories," Judge Willis said dismissively, his tone sharp. "You're here for a crime that you've already been caught committing." But Jaden wasn't listening. He wasn't asking for sympathy or approval. He wasn't trying to convince the judge of his innocence. He was speaking directly to the people in the room who saw him as nothing more than a potential criminal because of his race. "My father worked hard for everything we have," Jaden continued, his voice growing stronger. "He fought every day to provide for us. And my mother, she's the one who raised me to know what's right and wrong. She taught me to believe in fairness, to believe that no matter how many people look at me and see my skin color, I have a right to be treated like everyone else." He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. The photo was still in his hand, but his gaze shifted as if he were speaking directly to the judge and everyone else in the room. "You look at me, and you see a black kid from a neighborhood you've probably never even visited. You see someone you think is guilty because of the color of my skin, because I'm from a poor neighborhood. But I'm not a criminal. I'm a kid who's trying to make it. I'm a kid who's trying to survive in a world that doesn't care about people like me." For the first time in the entire hearing, there was a shift in the room. The prosecutor, who had been leaning over his desk with a smug expression, glanced away uneasily. The jury exchanged looks, unsure of how to process the emotional weight of Jaden's words. Jaden's mother stood up in the back, her hand resting on her chest as she watched her son. She had always told him to stay quiet, to avoid drawing attention. But today he was standing up for himself, and something about it gave her a sense of pride. Judge Willis's face remained stoic, but his gaze softened just slightly as he stared at the family photo in Jaden's hand. The brief moment of silence that followed was heavy, like the courtroom was holding its collective breath, waiting for something to break. "You think I care about your family's story?" Judge Willis finally spoke, his tone harsh again. "I'm here to deal with facts. And the fact is, you were caught red-handed, Jaden. Your history shows nothing but trouble. I don't care about your sob story. But Jaden wasn't finished. This isn't a sob story, he said, his voice cutting through the judge's dismissive tone. This is the truth. This is who I am. And I'm tired of people like you deciding my fate because of what you think you know about me. You don't know me. You don't know my family. You don't know the struggles we've faced. And you don't get to decide who I am. For a split second, Judge Willis looked almost uncomfortable. His hands, which had been tightly gripping the gavel, loosened slightly. He shifted in his seat, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The power dynamic in a room had shifted. For a brief moment, it was no longer about the crime Jaden was accused of. It was about something bigger, something deeper. The truth. The system that had kept Jaden and others like him in chains, metaphorically and literally, was now being challenged, not by the loud, angry protests of his peers, but by the simple, undeniable truth of a family photo. Jaden turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom. He wasn't just speaking to the judge anymore. He was speaking to the people in the room who had remained silent. The jurors, the prosecutor, the bailiff. Every person who had been complicit in the silence that allowed injustice to thrive. This isn't just my fight, he said quietly, but with undeniable strength. This is everyone's fight, and I'm not backing down. With that, Jaden turned and returned to his seat, still holding the photo. The gavel hadn't come down yet, but for the first time, the sound of it felt uncertain. The silence that followed Jaden's bold declaration was deafening. For a moment, the room seemed suspended in time, as if everything had frozen, locked in place by the raw emotion that had just been laid bare. Jaden sat back down, clutching the family photo in his hands, his chest rising and falling with each breath. His mother's eyes never left him, filled with a mixture of pride and fear. She knew that standing up in a room like this, against a system designed to crush him, wasn't just brave, it was dangerous. Judge Willis was the first to break the silence, though his voice was as cold as ever, barely concealing the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. Enough of this, he said, his voice sharp, a gavel raised in his hand. Your family story does not change the fact that you are here because of your own actions, Mr. Carter. You've been in and out of trouble for years. You don't get to use pity to escape the consequences. Jaden's heart raced. The words stung, but they didn't hurt as much as they used to. He had grown up hearing them. The assumptions, the dismissals, the constant reminder that the world would never see him as anything but a criminal. His family had taught him better, but society had always seen his skin before they saw his worth. Eleanor Walker, his attorney, stepped forward, clearly upset by the judge's behavior, but remaining composed. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. This boy has a right to defend himself. He is entitled to be seen as more than the label society has placed on him. Jaden is not the sum of his mistakes. He is not the criminal you are trying to make him into. This courtroom is supposed to be a place where justice is blind, where everyone is treated fairly, regardless of their race. The judge's lips curled into a thin, mocking smile. Justice is blind, Ms. Walker, he said, his eyes narrowing, but not to the facts. And the facts are that Jaden Carter has a history of trouble. His background speaks for itself. Jaden's mother, sitting quietly in the back, stood up suddenly. Her voice was soft but unwavering, the kind of strength only a mother could muster in the face of such adversity. That's not who he is, she said, her eyes piercing. He's more than his mistakes. He's more than the mistakes you think he's made. There was a momentary pause, as the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Jaden's mother's words hung in the air, daring the judge to dismiss them, daring him to ignore her. She was pleading not just for her son's freedom, but for his humanity, for his dignity. Judge Willis's gaze flicked from Jaden's mother back to Jaden, his eyes cold, calculating. He wasn't swayed by the emotional outbursts. In his eyes, this was nothing more than a nuisance. He had already made up his mind. Take your seat, Mrs. Carter, Judge Willis said dismissively, his voice cold. Your emotional appeal won't change the law. Jaden clenched his fists, feeling the anger surge through him. But he didn't stand up. He couldn't. The courtroom was still watching, and every move he made was being scrutinized. He had seen too many black boys like him dragged through this system, their lives shattered under the weight of false assumptions. This wasn't just about his freedom. It was about something much larger, the truth that the system wasn't blind to race, it was blind to justice. The prosecutor, who had been silent until now, stood up. His suit was sharp, his demeanor calm and collected, as though this was just another routine case to him. He had seen young black men in courtrooms before, and to him, Jaden was just another name on a long list of defendants. Your Honor, with all due respect, the prosecutor began, his voice smooth, we are here because the defendant committed a crime. The evidence is clear, and his past behavior indicates that he is a danger to the community. The fact that he wants to stand here and play the victim doesn't change that. The words were like a slap to the face. Jaden could feel the injustice radiating off the prosecutor, as if his race, his background, his very existence was enough to make him guilty. But Jaden wasn't about to let it go. Not now, not ever again. Can we stop pretending? Jaden said, his voice loud enough to echo through the courtroom. Can we stop pretending that this isn't about race? That this isn't about the way I'm treated because of the color of my skin? You've already decided who I am based on the things you think you know about me. You've already made your judgment. But I'm not going to sit here and let you pretend this is about anything else. There it was. The truth, raw and unfiltered, spilling from Jaden's mouth. His words were not just an accusation. They were a statement of defiance against a system that had failed him long before he ever stepped into this courtroom. Jaden looked directly at the prosecutor. You don't get to define me. You don't get to decide my future based on your assumptions about my race. The prosecutor opened his mouth, ready to respond, but the judge interrupted him, his voice cutting through the tension. Enough, Judge Willis shouted, slamming the gavel down hard. This court is not a place for political discourse. You will not use this space to air your grievances about race. But Jaden wasn't done. This is exactly what I'm talking about, he said, standing taller, his voice unwavering. This court is a reflection of the world outside. It's a place where people like me are seen as problems to be solved, not human beings with rights. You can't hide behind your gavel and pretend this isn't about race. The system doesn't work for people like me. It never has. Jaden's words echoed in the room. They were not just a plea for justice. They were a challenge to the status quo. He had spoken truth to power, and for the first time, the people in the room were forced to confront it. There was a heavy silence that followed, but it wasn't just the usual silence of a courtroom. It was the kind of silence that comes when something is changing, when something is shifting beneath the surface. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Jaden could feel the eyes of everyone on him, but this time, it wasn't just judgment. It was uncertainty. It was the kind of silence that comes when a lie is about to be exposed, when the truth can no longer be ignored. The weight of it all was heavy, pressing down on Jaden's chest as he stood, not out of defiance now, but from a deep sense of purpose. His words had left an indelible mark, not just on the prosecutor and the judge, but on everyone who was watching, whether they realized it or not. Jaden was no longer just a defendant in a case. He had become a voice for those who had been silenced for too long, a symbol of the fight against an unjust system that had always been rigged against him and countless others like him. Eleanor Walker, his attorney, stood beside him, a quiet but powerful presence. She had always known Jaden was different. There was something about him that refused to bow to the weight of the world's unfairness. But now, as she watched him, she saw a transformation. He was no longer just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting for every person who had ever been unjustly accused, for every person of color whose life had been defined by the system's bias. Your Honor, Eleanor said, breaking the silence with a voice that was steady but filled with emotion. Jaden has spoken the truth. This is not just about his case. It's about the way our entire system treats young black men. It's about the biases that permeate every corner of this courthouse, from the police officers who profile him to the prosecutors who target him. This court is meant to serve justice, but justice is not blind when it comes to race. Judge Willis shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between Eleanor and Jaden. The gavel in his hand felt heavier now, like an instrument that could no longer maintain the illusion of control. He had spent his career presiding over cases like this, cases that were so clearly one-sided, so clearly driven by racial bias. But today, something was different. Today, he was facing a challenge he couldn't easily dismiss. The prosecutor, still standing, clenched his jaw, his face flushed with frustration. He had expected Jayden to back down, to remain quiet, to accept the fate that had been handed to him. But Jayden wasn't following the script. He wasn't playing the role the system had cast him in. He was rewriting the narrative one word at a time. "You've heard the defendant's statements," the prosecutor finally said, his voice strained. But his actions speak louder than his words. He's been arrested multiple times. His background shows a pattern of criminal behavior. That's the reality we're facing here, not some emotional plea. Jayden looked the prosecutor dead in the eye. His anger was still there, but it had evolved. It was no longer just about defending himself. It was about exposing the lie that had been perpetuated for so long. He wasn't just the sum of his past mistakes. He was the sum of his hopes, his dreams, and his family struggles. He wasn't a criminal. He was a young man fighting for his future. "The reality," Jayden said, his voice cutting through the prosecutor's words, "is that I'm not the problem. The system is. The problem is a system that looks at me and sees a criminal because of my skin color, because of where I'm from. The problem is a judge who makes decisions based on stereotypes and assumptions instead of facts." The prosecutor opened his mouth to retort, but Jayden wasn't finished. "You want to talk about my record? Let's talk about the real record here. The one that shows how people like me are treated differently, how we're given harsher sentences for crimes we didn't commit. Let's talk about the countless black men and women who've sat in this courtroom before me. People whose lives have been ruined by a system that refuses to see them as human beings." Jayden's words hung in the air, and for the first time that day, he saw a shift in the room. The jurors, who had been sitting passively up until now, exchanged uneasy glances. The prosecutor looked unsure, his confident stance faltering for the first time. The judge's expression was unreadable, but his grip on the gavel tightened. Jayden had broken through the walls of indifference, and the truth was starting to seep in. His mother, still standing in the back of the room, couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. This was the son she had raised, a boy who had faced so many odds, so much hatred, and yet still stood tall. This was the boy who refused to be a victim. This was the boy who had decided that enough was enough. The judge cleared his throat, looking up at Jayden. For the first time, his gaze wasn't filled with judgment. It was filled with something else, something closer to doubt. "I will not tolerate this disrespect in my courtroom," Judge Willis finally said, but there was a hesitation in his voice that wasn't there before. "You will remain seated and allow the legal process to unfold." Jayden didn't back down. He didn't sit. He stood, silently challenging the judge's authority, silently demanding that the system see him for who he truly was. "I'm standing for my future," Jayden said, his voice low but resolute. "I'm standing for every person who's been told they don't matter. I'm standing because I know that, no matter how much you try to hold me down, I will never be silenced." The judge's hand hovered over the gavel, and for a long moment, it seemed as if the entire courtroom was waiting for him to bring it down to make the final decision. But in that moment, Jayden realized something. He had already won. The battle wasn't in the verdict. It was in the truth that had been spoken, in the awareness that had been awakened. The moment he stood up, he had already taken control. The gavel came down, but it was softer than Jayden expected. It wasn't the sharp, definitive crack that usually followed a ruling. It was the sound of the old system cracking under the weight of change. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Jayden stood there, still refusing to sit, his family photo still clutched in his hand, the same steady look in his eyes. The courtroom, which had once been filled with the sterile hum of routine, now felt like it was teetering on the edge of something much larger, something that couldn't be ignored. Judge Willis looked at the gavel in his hand, then at Jayden. His stern gaze had softened ever so slightly. For the first time in years, the judge found himself unsure, a rarity that did not sit comfortably with him. His authority, which had never before been questioned, now seemed shaky. The room was no longer just an extension of his control. It was a battleground for the deeper issues that had been buried for far too long. Jaden's words had done what his lawyer's arguments hadn't been able to. He had exposed the raw truth of a broken system, and for the first time, those in power were forced to confront it. But even with this recognition, there was still a great deal of resistance to the change Jaden was pushing for. The institutionalized racism that had long plagued the courtrooms, the police, and every facet of society didn't disappear just because one young black man decided he wouldn't accept it anymore. "Your Honor," Eleanor Walker said again, her voice ringing out with a new sense of urgency. "I urge you to look beyond the accusations and see the person standing here today. Jaden is not the same person who was arrested. He is a victim of racial profiling, of a system that's already determined his guilt before he even had a chance to prove his innocence." The judge remained silent, his eyes still fixed on Jaden. The crowd had become more than just passive observers. They were witnesses to a moment that many had never seen before. Black voices finally being heard, demanding their truth to be acknowledged. But the prosecutor, still standing, wasn't ready to concede. His face was flushed with frustration, his voice growing louder in an attempt to regain control of the situation. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the defendant is trying to manipulate the situation," the prosecutor said, his voice thick with condescension. "This has nothing to do with race. The facts remain the same. Jaden Carter was caught in possession of stolen property. His record is a reflection of his actions. His words today are nothing but an attempt to cloud the issue with baseless accusations about systemic racism." Jaden's eyes narrowed, and the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface started to surface again. But this time, it wasn't just about defending himself. It was about making sure that the world saw the system for what it was. It wasn't blind. It was built to serve some and suppress others. "That's the problem," Jaden shot back, his voice rising slightly as he addressed the prosecutor. "You're too busy talking about facts, about records, about the past. But you're ignoring the truth. I'm not the one who's been hurting this system. It's the system that's been hurting people like me. You're right about one thing. This isn't about just me. It's about every black person who's been forced to fight twice as hard to prove their worth." The prosecutor scoffed, clearly unsettled by Jaden's determination. He opened his mouth to retort, but the judge raised a hand, signaling him to stop. "Enough," Judge Willis commanded, his voice now carrying the weight of a decision that seemed to hang in the balance. He stood up, slamming the gavel down harder than usual, his gaze sweeping over the room, though his eyes seemed more distant than before. For a moment, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. Jaden stood, unwavering. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. In that moment, he wasn't just standing for himself. He was standing for every person who had been wronged by the system. "I have heard enough," Judge Willis finally said, his voice less certain than before. "Jaden Carter, you stand accused of grand theft auto and have a record that suggests a pattern of criminal behavior. However," the judge paused, clearly grappling with something he hadn't expected to confront. "However, it seems the circumstances of this case may require deeper reflection." The words felt like they were hanging in the air for a beat too long, as if Judge Willis was wrestling with his own conscience. He had always seen himself as an impartial figure, someone who delivered justice without bias. But the words Jaden had spoken, the defiance, the truth, it had shaken him. Jaden's heart pounded in his chest. He knew the judge wasn't about to exonerate him. Not just yet. But this was a small victory. For once, Jaden wasn't just another black boy being sentenced without a second thought. He wasn't statistic. He was a human being with a story, his story. The prosecutor opened his mouth to speak, but the judge silenced him with a sharp look. "We will adjourn for today," Judge Willis announced, his tone strained. "I will need time to review the facts and the arguments presented. The court will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. As the courtroom began to empty, Jaden stood still, feeling the weight of the moment. It wasn't over. The fight was far from done. But today, Jaden had done something important. He had made the system see him for who he truly was. And tomorrow, he would do it again. The courtroom buzzed with a mixture of whispers and murmurs as the doors to the chambers closed behind the judge. The momentary reprieve left Jaden and his mother standing together in the hallway outside the courtroom. Her hand gripped his, squeezing it tightly, her eyes never leaving him. She had been through this before. She had seen the disappointments, the unfair sentences, the constant struggle to keep hope alive in the face of an unjust system. But today felt different. Today, she saw something she hadn't seen before. Her son, standing tall and unyielding in the face of the very forces that had always sought to break him. "Jaden," she whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion. "You were incredible in there. I'm so proud of you." Jaden looked at her, his gaze tired but resolute. His body ached from the tension, from the weight of standing up against the tide of injustice. But he couldn't stop now. He couldn't back down, not when the stakes were this high. "I didn't do it for me, Mom," he said quietly. "I did it for everyone who's had to face this. For all the people who don't get to speak their truth. For all the kids who get thrown away by the system because of the color of their skin." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know, baby. I know." The courtroom doors opened again, and Eleanor Walker stepped out, her expression unreadable. She had been in the fight for so long, had seen it all before. The slow crawl of justice, the harsh realities of a system stacked against her clients. But today, something about Jaden's stand had touched her in a way she hadn't expected. "Jaden," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You did something today that most people wouldn't have the courage to do. You made them see you." He nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. "They're not going to change overnight. But maybe, just maybe, I can make them start thinking differently." Eleanor gave him a small smile, one that held more hope than she had expressed in a long time. "Maybe, but today you made a difference." The court reconvenes. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. The usual tension was thicker than before, the air heavy with anticipation. Word had spread about what had happened the previous day, the defiance in Jaden's voice, the challenge to the system that had gone unchallenged for so long. News outlets were starting to pick up the story. Social media buzzed with hashtags and heated discussions. And for once, people were starting to listen. The case had become more than just about one black teenager accused of theft. It had become a symbol of everything wrong with the justice system. Jaden sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap. His mother sat beside him, her face a mask of determination. Eleanor sat across from them, flipping through her legal notes, preparing for the next round. She knew this battle wasn't over, but something had shifted. The fight was no longer just about fighting the case. It was about challenging the biases that ran deep within the institution itself. Judge Willis entered the courtroom, his demeanor as rigid as ever, but something in his eyes was different. There was a tension in his movements, as though the previous day's confrontation had unsettled him. He glanced at the courtroom, and for a brief moment, Jaden thought he saw a flicker of doubt in the judge's eyes. He took his seat and looked directly at Jaden. The usual authority he held was still there, but today it seemed fragile, as if the weight of his position was suddenly too much to bear. Jaden wasn't sure if the judge would let him go, or if he'd let the system continue its vicious cycle, but he was determined to make it clear that he would not go quietly. The gavel came down with a firm, sharp sound, but there was no finality in it. Not this time. This time, it felt more like the beginning of something that could, hopefully, end with the system rethinking its very foundation. After a long silence, Judge Willis finally spoke. "I've had time to reflect on what was presented in this courtroom yesterday," he began, his voice steady, but with an unmistakable edge of hesitation. "And I must admit, there are aspects of this case that trouble me deeply." Jaden straightened in his seat, his heart hammering in his chest. This was it, the moment of reckoning. Systemic biases have no place in our courts. Judge Willis continued, his gaze briefly shifting to the members of the jury, who were now listening intently. "The law must be applied fairly and equally, without regard to race, background, or social standing." The room held its breath. Could this be happening? Could this judge, known for his harshness and rigidity, truly be recognizing the flaws in the system? Jaden's mother looked at him, a mixture of surprise and cautious optimism crossing her face. Jaden clenched his fists under the table. He didn't want to get his hopes up. He couldn't. But for the first time, he felt like there might be a chance. "I've read the transcripts," Judge Willis continued, "and I've listened to the arguments. But it's clear that this case is not just about a crime being committed. It's about the broader issue of how young black men are treated by the justice system." Jaden's breath caught in his throat. He had heard the words, but hearing them from a figure of power, a judge, made them feel more real, more tangible. The racial profiling, the assumptions made based solely on the color of your skin, it's something we, as a court, can no longer ignore, Judge Willis said. His voice grew firmer with each word. "It's something I can no longer ignore." The room was still. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Jaden couldn't believe what he was hearing. This wasn't just about his case anymore. This was about something much bigger, the recognition of the systemic racism that had haunted his life and the lives of so many others. Judge Willis took a deep breath before continuing. "Jaden Carter, after reviewing all the evidence and considering the gravity of the arguments presented in this courtroom, I have decided to dismiss all charges against you." The words landed like a wave crashing against the shore. Jaden sat frozen for a moment, unable to comprehend what had just happened. His mother gasped softly beside him, tears springing to her eyes. Eleanor reached over and squeezed his shoulder, her face a mixture of triumph and relief. "However," Judge Willis added, his voice now quiet but resolute, "the journey towards true justice is not yet over. This case has opened a wider discussion, one that I will personally ensure is explored further. This court will undergo a review of its procedures to ensure that such racial biases do not continue to taint our justice system." It wasn't a perfect resolution, and Jaden knew that, but it was a victory, a moment in which the system had been forced to confront itself, to acknowledge its flaws, and to begin the difficult task of reform. Jaden's eyes welled with tears, but he held them back. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been wrongly accused, every person who had ever been judged by the color of their skin, not the content of their character. "Thank you," Jaden whispered, his voice barely audible as he turned toward his mother. "We did it." The days following the verdict felt like a whirlwind for Jaden and his family. News outlets, social media, and local communities were all buzzing with the story of the courtroom drama that had unfolded the previous week. Jaden had become more than just a defendant. He had become a symbol of resistance against a system that had failed so many others, a voice for the voiceless. Jaden had hoped for a small moment of peace, but the world wasn't done with him yet. His case had become a rallying cry for activists and civil rights groups, pushing for change within the legal system. But it was also a magnet for those who still believed that Jaden had gotten off easy, that he was just another troublemaker who had played the race card to avoid punishment. Walking through the hallways of his high school, Jaden noticed the whispers and stares. Some of them were filled with admiration, but there were others too, the ones that mocked him behind his back, questioning if he had really been innocent or if he had just gotten lucky. Despite the external noise, Jaden felt more certain than ever about his place in the fight for justice. He wasn't just going to fade into the background after this. No, his story was far from over. Jaden's newfound platform had its drawbacks. His social media was flooded with messages, some supportive, others downright hateful. People criticized him for playing the race card, while others hailed him as a hero. The pressure weighed heavily on him. He was just a teenager, after all. His fight for justice hadn't ended with the case. It had only just begun. In the midst of all the chaos, a familiar voice reached out to him. Someone who had been a steady presence in his life through the hardest moments. His mentor, Mr. Thompson, a local activist who had been fighting for racial justice for decades. "Jaden, you're carrying a heavy burden, but it's not one you have to carry alone," Mr. Thompson said over the phone. "The eyes of the world are on you now, and they expect you to change things. But remember, the work doesn't start or end with your case. It's the thousands of kids who never get to speak, It's the families who keep losing their sons and daughters to a system that doesn't care. Jaden listened carefully, the weight of Mr. Thompson's words sinking in. He wasn't just a symbol. He was part of a larger movement, and it was up to him to take the next step, to push for real change that extended beyond his case. "I won't let this be the end," Jaden said, the determination clear in his voice. "I'll make sure this conversation doesn't stop with me." Jaden's commitment to justice grew as he started working with local organizations to advocate for reform. He became involved in town hall meetings, public speaking engagements, and eventually protests that pushed for police accountability and racial equality. His mother, once so hesitant to have her son in the spotlight, stood by his side, proud to see the man he was becoming. But the road wasn't easy. There were setbacks, opponents who tried to discredit him, politicians who labeled him a troublemaker. But for every challenge, Jaden found strength in the people who supported him. He wasn't fighting alone. One day, after a particularly heated debate about systemic police violence, Jaden stood before a crowd, his voice unwavering. "The world doesn't change because we sit quietly," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "It changes because we refuse to accept injustice, no matter how deeply it's rooted. We got to stand up, together, for those who can't." The crowd erupted in applause. In that moment, Jaden realized that the work he had started wasn't just about reforming the system. It was about changing hearts and minds, educating the public, challenging their perceptions, and building a future where no one had to fight the same fight he had fought. The fight was far from over, but Jaden wasn't backing down. He knew that his story, his truth, was just the beginning of something much bigger. It wasn't just about him. It was about every young person who had been unfairly judged, every black teenager who had been overlooked, ignored, or criminalized. Jaden had become a beacon of hope, and with that light, he would continue to lead the charge for justice and equality, for all the lives that had been lost to the system, for every person who was still waiting for their day in court. As the dust settled from the courtroom and Jaden's fight for justice continued to ripple through his community, the message was clear. Change isn't a moment, it's a movement. Jaden's story was never meant to end with his exoneration or a single courtroom victory. It was the spark, the beginning of a conversation that needed to be had, not just in courtrooms or boardrooms, but in every home, every school, every community. It was a conversation that required all of us to confront the uncomfortable truths about the systems that have always been built to oppress. As Jaden stood at the forefront of a movement for racial justice, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every person who had ever been treated unfairly, every family torn apart by the weight of racial profiling and bias. And as he continued his work, speaking at rallies, attending town hall meetings, and engaging in real conversations about systemic change, his message was simple but powerful. Racism isn't just something that happens to someone else. It happens every day, all around us. It's in the systems that govern us, the assumptions we make about others, the way we treat people who don't look like us. But we can change that. We can change the way we see each other. We can fight the systems that are built to oppress, but only if we take action, together. It's time to make a commitment to change. This isn't a battle for one individual or one community. It's a battle for all of us. Here's what you can do right now. Engage in the conversation. Have the difficult conversations. Ask questions, challenge assumptions, and educate yourself on the issues of racism and systemic inequality. Every conversation counts. The more we talk about racism, the less power it has over us. Support anti-racism movements. Get involved with organizations, both local and national, that are fighting for racial equality. Donate, volunteer, and share their work. Every bit of support helps. Stand with those who are leading the charge for justice. Raise your voice, whether through social media, protests, or simply speaking up when you see racism happening. Don't stay silent. Racism thrives when we stay silent, but our collective voices are powerful. Use your voice to demand change. Hold systems accountable. Advocate for policies that dismantle systemic inequality. This includes criminal justice reform, education reform, and equal economic opportunities. Push for real change at the local and national level. Be an ally. Stand beside marginalized communities. Amplify their voices. Support them, listen to them, and take action when you see injustice. You don't have to be black to be anti-racist. Together, we are stronger. Teach future generations. Educate children and young adults about racism, equality, and the importance of empathy. Change starts with the next generation, and it's our responsibility to ensure they grow up knowing the value of justice and equality for all. Jaden's victory wasn't just for him, it was for everyone. But it won't mean anything unless we all take up the mantle. We have the power to reshape the systems that divide us. We have the power to fight back against the prejudice that divides our communities, our homes, our hearts. The fight for justice begins with us, and it begins now. So, ask yourself, what are you doing to be a part of this change? Don't wait for someone else to make the difference. It's on all of us to make the world a better place for every single person. The time for change is now. Will you stand up?